Insurance isn't our only passion at UFG Insurance. We're dedicated to supporting the communities where we live and work. We proudly offer our employees paid time off to volunteer. Their work is making a positive difference across the U.S. UFG's Go Beyond Award is presented to one employee annually for exceptional community service. Striving to deliver on our promises is more than what we do. It's who we are. For a company promising community support, think UFG.
Okay, welcome everybody to the first session of track of sessions on Iowa Ideas 2023. I know people are joining us in progress here, so we'll get more people to join us as we go along here. My name is Craig Jamolis. I'm enterprise editor of the Cedar Rapids Gazette, which is putting on this annual virtual session. This particular session is in the community track. And the name of the session is The Impact of Declining Populations on Iowa's Way of Life. If you've navigated to us by mistake, meant to go to another session, you're more than welcome to stay with us. It's not quite like getting on the wrong plane at the airport. We're not going to take you to Peoria, I guess you will. We have some really interesting panelists here, and I think we'll have a good discussion. Let me first, before I introduce the panel, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors here of Iowa Ideas. Our presenting sponsor is ITC Midwest. And for the people who are not familiar with what that is, it's a Cedar Rapids-based company. And they are one of the major players in the Midwestern power grid. And all of us who live through the derecho know how important the work they do is. And a major player in our area. And for this track, we're also sponsored by UFG Insurance. It's a Cedar Rapids nationwide property and casualty insurer. And because of our sponsors' commitment to a better Iowa, participants across the state can be in this session for free, and there's no registration fee. And a special shout out to them. That. The name of our session, as I said, is the impact of declining populations on Iowa's way of life. And just some background here about what we're talking about here is that when the 2020 census came out, looking back over the last year, the last 10 years, Iowa had gained 4.7% in population over the decade. But that was that showed in four counties grew, 68 counties had declines. And so essentially our urban counties grew, our rural counties declined, although there were some exceptions and some cities actually gained population. But we've seen a continuing decline in rural populations for years. And so what implications does that have for the quality of life that we are known for in Iowa? That's what we're going to talk about here today. So let me, without talking about that some more, let me quickly introduce our panelists. I may introduce them in the order they don't show on your screen, so forgive me. But with us today is Dustin Miller, who's Executive Director of the Iowa Chamber Alliance. Rick Honsecker, who is the Region 12 Executive Director of the Iowa Council of Governments. That's in West Central Iowa. Iowa's divided into, I think it's 17 Council of Governments, and he's in Region 12. Bill Menner, who is Executive Director of the Iowa Rural Development Council, and Rachel Lindeen, Vice President of the Mount Pleasant Area Chamber of Commerce. And so we have some good panelists here. Let me jump first into our conversation by turning to Rachel. As you know, Mount Pleasant is dealing with some extra challenges right now that a lot of communities aren't dealing with because Iowa Wesleyan closed in May. And Iowa Wesleyan was here in Iowa before Iowa was even a state. So it's a pretty big loss for a community. I just want to jump right in and talk about kind of the Mount Pleasant experience. and what is life there like now since the college closed 4 or 5 months ago?
All right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Craig. I am Rachel Lundeen with the Mount Pleasant Area Chamber Alliance. And so our office plays the role of economic development and being the local chamber of commerce for our county region. So as you mentioned, Iowa Wesleyan did announce closure as of May 31st after 181 years. That means that the college was there before our town of Mount Pleasant was there. So our community grew up around the college. And for those that are not familiar with Mount Pleasant, it is kind of in the heart of our, a couple blocks away from our main square, main center of town. So Mount Pleasant did grow up around the College of Iowa Wesleyan. So we are in the process of figuring out what does Mount Pleasant look like without a four-year college institution. I will tell you that our business community remains really strong. We are resilient, things are looking up, but we still have a lot of unknowns as it relates to what's next. So currently, there are paths forward for most of the campus. We're not too worried about that, but from a chamber and economic development standpoint, we're really starting to look at and hear what is happening in our businesses and what has been the impact. You know, there's all those kinds of equations out there that will tell you what an economic impact of that college was. But we're really trying to figure out how many less pizzas is the local pizza joint selling each Friday night, or what is the impact on our local grocery stores and just different places where the students would hang out and shop. And we probably won't know that for a full year, but we are making our way.
Rachel, you talked earlier about some of the employment numbers about not only did students go to school at the university, but they also worked in the community, worked for restaurants, other places. And you were talking about what effect that has had on the workforce.
Yeah, so, you know, here I am sitting in the middle of our town square, and I can look out and see several businesses that use those students as work staff. One restaurant in particular, with the announcement of the closure, they lost 6 front of house staff. So basically they lost their bartender, all their wait staff, and their hostess in one announcement. And so that one's tough to hear. A local shoe store down the street, they lost 3 employees right away. You know, when it's a staff of 6 or 7 to begin with, they lost half of their workforce with one announcement. So they have all hired, rehiring. It looks a little different. Some of them maybe have even changed their hours, 1 less day a week or an hour each day. But the businesses are still open. They still have rehired, but like a lot of businesses in all of our communities, they're always looking for more help.
Yeah, you touch on a lot of things here with the university closing that affects quality of life. And it's, how many pizzas are sold, how many, what the grocery store looks like. But also, extends beyond that, because one of the things the university did was, I hate to use the term, but things to do. If people in the community wanted to go to a lecture or a concert or a sporting event, the university was there. And one thing that rings in a bell in my mind was that one of the most famous graduates of Iowa Wesleyan was the astronaut, and Peggy Whitson. And she held events there from time to time with STEM events, and people brought their daughters to for women. And by the way, she was a keynote speaker at Iowa Ideas a couple years ago. So that has been an effect as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you're absolutely right. College did bring culture, right? It brought educational topics and talks that the community could attend as long as they're with their students. They had a robust music program, so every season there was a concert that the students would host, but it would always be open to the public, like you said, the sporting events. But the other thing that we are really figuring out is the Southeast Iowa Symphony is based will continue to be based here in Mount Pleasant. The path forward looks like they're going to be able to have some offices and still have some performing arts space. Details are to be determined, but just this past week, our symphony was able to practice again in a chapel, which is, it seems small, but for our community, it was a really big deal.
Interesting. I want to come back to that about the other quality of life besides the workforce. But let me back out for a minute and talk on a broader scale across Iowa. And Dustin Miller, I'm going to call on you next here. One of the things that the Chamber Alliance has done is in the last few years have launched the talent pool. And when I think about workforce and filling jobs, that's certainly one of the things that the talent poll looks at. Dustin, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what is the talent poll, why do we have it, and what are some of the key findings that's had that would apply to this category we're talking about today?
Yeah, Craig, and thanks for having me on this. And the Iowa Talent Poll is in its third year. For those that aren't familiar with the Iowa Chamber Alliance, we represent the 15 largest communities across the state. But as most chambers have looked towards regionalization, that's what we've seen within our chambers as the labor sheds across those large communities have a ripple effect all across the state. And in 2019, we actually shifted our number one priority from economic development incentives, business climate, up to talent attraction. And really in 2019, we said Iowa is, if people didn't know this, since 1900, the slowest growth state in the country. And if that doesn't change, the ripple effects on the economic growth side are immense. We didn't know in 2019 what we would face in 2020 as far as population and talent being exacerbated. But we took that priority, moved it to the top, and then in the 2020 timeframe had the idea of, well, I wonder what it would look like to get a sense of how Iowans feel about their state. What do they value? And potentially what are things that Iowans don't like that would consider them moving to somewhere else. And what's really great is we found a baseline. We're in our third year, as I mentioned. We go out to about 1,200 Iowans through polling and gather a bunch of baseline data that year after year will be iterative on some base level questions and then some tweaks depending upon what we're seeing year to year. And the information, Craig, we got back that was really positive is we have a great base to build from. Why do people like Iowa? Small town feel, affordability, economic mobility. These are things that came across, but where do we struggle? Just as Rachel mentioned in her community, we struggle in entertainment opportunities, and so what we have to do, and really what we found in the analysis, and when you go deep into the crosstabs, there's generational aspects to this. Our workforce, which is our population, it is older. And if we're going to attract what is the next demographic change, for those that don't know, 2016 was the first crossover where post-millennials, both millennials and Gen Z, from a population standpoint, became the largest segment of our workforce. So what we're really trying to understand is if we're going to compete economically, we are going to have to attract more people in that space to fill our work, because what we see across the state is low, medium, and high skill employers needing bodies.
And that's true. And there's so many different implications of workforce. I want to get to some of those. Satisfying the workforce we have and retaining the workforce we have, and then attracting new people to the workforce. It translates into not only entertainment and culture, but also housing. internet access, access to healthcare, you name it, it goes on. So I want to take some of those up in the time we have here. But for now, I want to talk a little bit about workforce. For anybody who's been living in Iraq and over the last couple of years, we don't have enough workers. We have more jobs in Iowa than we have people to fill them. So I was going to turn to Rick and let me start with Rick here. I'm just kind of curious what you're hearing from businesses and governments in your area about how they're responding to the workforce needs. Are you hearing that they're trying new things they haven't tried before, or are they finding themselves in a competitive situation they weren't in before? I'm just kind of wondering what you're hearing from businesses and governments in your community about especially about workforce and what might be some of the things you have to tackle as a result of that.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on the panel this morning. Workforce has been consistently in the past few years one of our number one issues. It trades off with housing. And I think it's one of those things that took even our economic developers by surprise. 20 years ago, I think that workforce and housing were not necessarily something they really thought of as being mainline economic development, with sites and buildings and incentives. But workforce, it's always out there. And we have, at least in our region, several small manufacturers who struggle to find people. Some of that has been answered by automation, that if we can decrease the need for workers, it's helpful. That isn't always the case. We're currently working with a company, it's not in our region, but where they have an automated line and a semi-automated line, and the automated line takes twice as many people to run it as the semi-automated line takes. So I guess there's probably limits in automation. There has been discussion of recruiting from other parts of the country. I think that's difficult to do. We've talked about, do we really have the amenities that people want to come for? But some of our jobs, entry-level jobs at the hospital, starting out at the school, working on the line at some of the factories, these individuals are looking for good, solid jobs with decent wages. So I think there has been wages as one of those things that have crept up. That's made it harder, I think, especially for some of our small businesses to remain viable. Some of our retail businesses, Main Street businesses, I think are the ones that are finding it most difficult to fill positions, but they answer it with different ways. Like Rachel said, it might be decreased hours. Some of them are looking at e-commerce as an opportunity. Some of them are just specializing in the types of products that they do, which in the day of box stores is one of those strategies where you can be a successful Main Street business. So workforce is a challenge. And if you're going to bring people in, you need places for them to live, and you need affordable places for them to live. And that's probably a whole nother session on affordable housing, and particularly in rural areas, how we can address that. But as we look at, even as some of our communities have become smaller, the density of housing has become smaller. So we have 1- and 2-person households where you may have had 5 and 6 people living previously. So, but workforce, though, it's a challenge. It's something I think that our rural communities are attacking on multiple levels as they figure out how businesses may best respond and what's best for that business long term.
Yeah, you're right about housing. I do want to touch on housing because you're right. It's probably a full session by itself, but I do want to touch on it here because it's such a related thing to workforce as well. So we'll get into that in a minute here. But staying with the general topic of workforce, and maybe Bill wants to weigh in here as well. I'm wondering, you mentioned automation. I led a panel last year at Iowa Ideas about automation, how more companies in Iowa are turning to it, not because they're somehow enamored with automation, but because they can't find enough workers, and so they want to expand, and so they're turning to that some more. Bill, I was wondering the same question for you in terms of what are you hearing from businesses or others in your daily life here that would tell you how business are responding to the workforce? Are some of them just saying we can't expand even though we want to, or is there any success stories out there where somebody has said, yeah, I've managed to fill a lot of my jobs, and here's what I'm doing to make that happen? I don't know if any of those exist yet.
Well, let's put this in perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Dustin mentioned the year 1900. In 1900, 75% of Iowans lived in rural places. We were still an agrarian economy. In 2020, 36% of Iowans lived in rural communities. So, I mean, this isn't a last 10 years or 20 years thing. This is a century-old process that isn't just happening in Iowa. It's happening in rural places around the country. People are moving to urban areas, whether it's for work, for recreation, for access to healthcare, for access to housing. There are a whole lot of reasons that rural communities are declining in population. I mean, there's Iowa State University even has a theory out there called shrink smart, which is how do you continue to be a viable, attractive place, even if your population's declining? The implications of a smaller population are pretty obvious. You have fewer people paying taxes. You have maybe fewer resources from a personnel perspective, whether it's workforce, whether it's leadership, whether it's civic engagement, whether it's just having neighbors around. So, we've been figuring this out for over 100 years, and the answers aren't obvious. If I'm an employer and I'm trying to figure out how to get more people to work for me, I hope I've at least considered raising their wages. In a competitive situation, how do you get more workers? You pay them more, which means you have to raise your prices, which means inflation. So, I mean, this is sort of the chicken and egg. What do you have? Housing first or workers first? Or is it access to healthcare? Or is it great schools? Or is it clean water? Everyone's definition of quality of life, or what are those key elements of quality, are different. In Carroll County, there may be a different answer to that than where I am in Poweshiek County. But we know that folks have different ideas for what they require, whether they already live here or whether they're considering a move. So if I'm an employer, I'm going to look hard at internal factors that are influencing, my ability to recruit and retain, whether it's wages or benefits or the ability to work remotely, et cetera. But I'm also going to look at external factors like how far are my employees commuting every day? How much are they paying of their paycheck? How much are they paying for housing? Can they get access to healthcare or childcare or a great education? And small towns have less capacity to address those issues at the local level than you do in a big city. There are fewer people. They may, not be experts in grant writing or economic development or leadership development. And that's why, for example, I always ask a rural community that I'm talking to when they're struggling, have you even talked to your COG about this? Because the COG can be that first point of reference, the first point of contact for a small town that's trying to address these issues.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned that. Go ahead, Rick.
Bill brings up commuting, and that's something I should have mentioned. We have several employers that look to population areas that are still rural communities that have expanded their populations primarily due to new populations and diversity, and they are arranging for groups of those employees to come in and work. And these are primarily industries that have shifts. And so you'll see we do that through our transit system. I know other transit systems have large buses that they're commuting people in. The second strategy that they've used is accessing inmates through Iowa Prison Industries and cooperating. You've got to be close, enough that you can do that. But we do have a prison in Rockwell City. We have several employers that have transported men in from that facility, it's great all the way around to do that. But I think there's limited ability in parts of the state to be able to take advantage of that.
I do, Bill, thank you for bringing up Shrink Smart, because I do want to talk about that a little bit later here. But several people mentioned housing, and I think we need to talk about that because it's so intrinsically related to workforce, ability to retain and attract workforce. I guess Rick and Bill, and of course Dustin and Rachel, please weigh in on this also. But just in terms of housing, it might seem counterintuitive at the beginning to say, well, gosh, if communities are losing population, why isn't there too much housing, not enough? But it's not quite that simple. I just wonder if, Rick, if you could tell us a little about why housing is so important to communities, and what are some of the issues why it would be important? You mentioned commuting, and that being one of them.
Markets have been really, really tight. Yeah. Maybe with interest rates more recently, I think there are some units that aren't moving as fast, but there were times we have communities where the only way that you can buy a house is at the funeral home. And we have a lot of issues. One is you have people living longer. So you have a lot of single elderly that are in homes that haven't moved out. But I'm a good example of that. I'm a person that has a house that I'm the only one that's in the house. And you've got that it's just more and more people don't have as many kids. So you may have less population, but you need more housing units. In addition, we have old units in rural Iowa. We have communities that haven't seen a new unit that have been constructed in a long time. And so when 80-90% of your units are 50 years old or older, there's a maintenance issue and they're not as high quality. When you lose a house in a community, fire due to nuisance issues, it's really, really hard to replace it. It's expensive to build new housing. And then you don't know if it's going to appraise out once you build it. So there's little incentive for the private sector to take the risk when they aren't going to be able to reap much reward. And so it is a big thing with employers. It's tough. We've had it as an employer. I have people that, for my planning positions, that will move in from out of state. It's because we happen to know landlords that we can call and get on a list. It's not like you can just move to a community and pick up the paper and choose from 10 different places where you want to go live. So even though there's less people, the housing quality is an issue, and it is so hard to build new housing.
And I would jump on with what Rick said and agree. From a building standpoint, I'm also an attorney with the Nyemaster law firm, so we represent a number of developers, both both on the economic development corp side and then also on the actual builder side. And Rick's exactly right. I mean, the challenge is typically in most small communities, the statistics are there that typically the median household income is going to be lower. And so we've seen large projects that have to be pretty heavily subsidized in order to get market-based rates for a large project. And there's 17 communities in the Des Moines metro area that people don't need a single incentive to go build houses that are sold before they're built. And so it's really challenging on that volume build side to get somebody to go build 10 homes. And so what you end up seeing is, in smaller communities, one person who builds maybe a home a summer, and it just can't keep up if you're trying to fill, in Bill's neck of the woods in Grinnell, if those employers are saying, well, I want, I'm trying to attract people that the housing stock is of quality of the folks are trying to get, it's just really challenging because of the economics of how do I move a crew out there? And the material movement is going to cost me more. And I have a number of developers that, they'll get calls, especially on historic properties in communities, say, well, we have this great old factory downtown. We'd love to, let's gut it and turn it into. And I have developers that I represent that they just have to say to the community, this is what it's going to cost. And they say, well, that's expensive. And that's the reality, because they can go do it in other places. And how do you fill that gap? And I'll stop there. Is I think that's why you see this massive success and queue in the workforce housing tax credits across the state, because it lessens it helps the margin out in making a project viable. And I think those are the things that we have to think creatively. And one small thing is low to moderate income housing restrictions. I know it's hit Bill's community in Grinnell, where in the TIF set asides, it's really challenging. When you do the math, you have to build a house for $186,000. And I don't know of a house that goes up for $186,000 in any community across the state. So the economics, how we help the economics in smaller communities, we do need some public policy shifts to help that, help those gaps.
And you mentioned the workforce tax credits, which is something the state has been increasingly doing here. But my understanding of those is that the demand for those far outstrips the money available for that. Is that true?
Yeah. So a couple years ago, they actually put a bump in it to get rid of what was about a $50 million backlog. And then they jumped the amount of money annually for it. But because the program has been so successful, I know there's a couple projects in Mount Pleasant. There's projects going up all around the state. The queue has built up again because people know how to use it. There's interest in, obviously, improved housing stock across the state. So I think it's something that's been successful. So now we have to figure out, can you just keep throwing money to it, or do you target where those dollars actually go, where the need is most?
Let me just back up here for a minute and just remind the audience that if you have questions you want to ask, please submit them. Those would be certainly welcome. And also, I should probably mention a caveat here in terms of quality of life. In the journalism industry, when we're writing a story, we always have what we call the "to be sure" paragraph, and that's like 4 or 5 paragraphs in the story where we say, hey, there are some exceptions here, or there could be a caveat or something that's more complicated than you know. And I should probably say that about quality of life also, because quality of life is one of those things that's can be measured, but at the same time, it's a lot of people's perception. And I don't want to leave the impression that just because community lost population, they also lost their quality of life. Some of them may have retained the quality of life and may have actually improved. Conversely, there are communities that grew population, and they may not have grown their quality of life score. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of saying that. The one thing that is true is that the fewer people you have, the less resources you have to tackle some of these things. And so I just want to throw that caveat out there as well. I was going to ask you about, and we talked a little bit about workforce development and housing, and those are closely related. One of the other things that is kind of running in the background, and I'm not sure how big of a deal it is in the people you work with, but one of the things that the Iowa Talent Poll found, and also some ISU research found a couple of years ago, is that Iowa does have a good story to tell about several different things. People perceive that their school systems are good, and they perceive that safety is good. So there are good stories to tell about Iowa, and some communities actually have a story about themselves to get attention. Probably the most obvious example here is Dyersville and the Field of Dreams and that whole mythology that's been wrapped around that. But we have smaller examples, including LeClaire, which is home to the American Pickers TV show. And we have the made-up story of Riverside that supposedly is the birthplace of the fictional character, Captain Kirk of Star Trek. So we have a little bit of some of these stories. I was just kind of curious, based on your experience, are you hearing anybody talk about having some kind of a strategic plan where they tell the positive stories about the community, despite all the other challenges that we face?
I would add, I mean, really what you're talking about, Craig, is what's become pretty common in the vernacular of economic developers and chambers. And Rick kind of alluded to this, what a chamber director and economic development director was doing 20 years ago is very different than what they're doing now. And the common term you hear now is placemaking, and really looking at your community and what makes you unique and leveraging those local assets to say, hey, larger town, but Davenport, hey, Bix Beiderbecke is from here, and music is our thing, and leveraging that. Mason City with Wilson, and I mean, what is unique? I mean, you look at in Western Iowa, Walnut, with what they've done with antiques, and it's become an attraction sort of tool for them. That's what I'm seeing in my communities, is the economic developers, to Rick's point, have really transitioned to some of these other things that 20 years ago would have felt tertiary, that creating public spaces that are attractive to people, creating public art, housing projects, that's just as important as landing a 200 employee factory in your community, and almost more important, because it isn't, and I agree with Rick wholeheartedly on this, you're just not going to attract somebody away from mountains and oceans. That's just a real challenge. How do it's not that you don't try, but the focus on retention is really important, because how do you make sure that the folks you have don't make the choices, as Bill mentioned? It isn't necessarily always the problem of somebody moving to Illinois or somebody moving to Minnesota. It's somebody moving from Mount Pleasant to Davenport. And, how do you make your community attractive? You have to look inwardly and have local leadership to find those tools to say, this is what we are, and put our stake in the ground.
Yeah, it really is about leadership, isn't it? And having the people that step up to do things. And how do you think about, are we making this community great for somebody else? But really, you should be making it great for yourself. Do you like good parks? Do you want a nice library? Do you want a beautiful downtown? Do you want to have quality places where people to live, which is all about rental inspection and nuisance abatement? Do you want to have nice trails? Do you have community events? And all of that is with leadership. It's leadership in government. It's leadership in the private sector. And, so placemaking, like Dustin said, that is what people talk about. But to me, it isn't. You shouldn't be doing that for other people, because that will organically, if you're a bright spot and you're happy and you like where you are, people are going to come for your festival. They're going to hear about it. Your star is going to shine because you're proud of it. You want to make a good place where you are to live. Other people are going to want to come there too.
Hey, Rachel, I'm curious. I've worked with your community for many years now in one form or another. And, you host the Old Threshers every year. You have some amazing downtown rehabilitation of historic buildings. You have some vibrant local industry. Where's your strategic plan pointing you right now, other than leaving the Iowa Wesleyan, issue off to the side?
Bill, I'm really glad you asked that, and I think this answers Craig's initial question too. It's a work in progress as we speak, because we had a plan, and then you could relate we're a town of about 9,000 people, and last spring we lost 800 residents, right? So all of a sudden, we are in the process of rethinking who and what we are. What is, not to say that our identity was Iowa Wesleyan, because we are more, we're a lot of things, but we are currently restarting those conversations. So it's not that we're starting from scratch, but we kind of are. City and county leadership, I probably have been on a half a dozen meetings in the last 6 weeks, or actually 2 weeks, and said, we need a new plan. And so who are we? We're pretty pleasant here in Mount Pleasant, but how do we make us even better? So maybe we can have a part 2 conversation next year on this conference.
I think really Mount Pleasant has capacity to start that conversation. A lot of small rural places don't even know where to start, how to begin thinking strategically about what comes left. And then the challenge becomes, how do you lift up those, 750 to 800 really small rural places that don't have a Rachel sitting in their chamber office?
Yeah. To follow it up and say, I think that there's an appetite, right? It will be an easier conversation because people are eager. The business community wants to know what's next. We're going to be okay. Like, I know this because I'm in those daily conversations, but I would have to say, I think our community has an appetite for what's next.
Several people have mentioned in different venues here, talking about leadership. And one thing that Iowa is known for is that when we face adversity, people come together and figure out a solution. And that kind of gets to the question of, where do these leaders come from? And how are they developed in our communities? And Bill, you might want to talk about this a little bit, because I think that's one of the categories that the council has been working on as well. And I know this is probably true in Mount Pleasant, where people are coming together, volunteers are coming together to weigh in on Wesleyan and other plans as well. But I just want to talk about leadership again, because that's such an important piece of this. It's not physical like housing or a job, but it's more volunteering to run for office or to get involved in setting a strategic plan. Bill, do you want to talk about that a little bit in terms of what opportunities are there? Could there be for potential leaders in communities?
Well, I always tell folks that in a small town, your leadership role has an exponentially higher impact than it has in a bigger area, because there's a smaller universe of folks who are driving, whether it's public policy or local activities or coaching or being on the library board or whatever. The Rural Development Council has been involved in its partnership primarily through Empower Rural Iowa. And in fact, there's a leadership exchange coming up this month or next that brings together communities that either have a local leadership program that want to develop it or want to explore that concept of growing local leaders. At the end of the day, and I'm someone who serves on a whole bunch of volunteer boards or leads volunteer boards. And when you're in a small town, so Grinnell, community of 9,000, just like Mount Pleasant, we're a big city in comparison to many of the small towns. And then you wind up with the usual suspects, and you go back to the same people to be on the board or serve as a council member or a school board member or a coach or whatever it is. And the challenge is, strategically, how do you work with communities or convince communities to expand the scope? So sometimes that means reaching out to younger people, God forbid, or people that aren't old white guys like me. That idea that you have to look harder for leaders and then give those people you identify a chance to step up. Lots has been written recently about the fact that people my age and of my gender and race aren't getting out of the way. And so there's an opportunity there to help grow leaders and give them meaningful opportunities to lead. And frankly, it does have to happen at the local level, which piles one more thing on those small towns that already are struggling with capacity to make things happen.
Which, Bill, means new ideas too, right? Like not getting
Yeah.
out of the way. You may come up with an idea, hey, we need to have public art out there. I may think that's terrible. And the old gang may think that why would we want to waste money on that? But you've got to be accepting of these new ideas so that they can develop their leadership. Because, you know, eventually you're going to be dead. And maybe people like public art. So that's when you say people got to get out of the way. That's true. You have to let people lead. You have to accept that things may be different in your community because younger people and new people want different things, and that's good. That makes a community interesting.
Maybe it's just a governance issue, Rick. Maybe it just means putting term limits in place.
Yeah. Well, speaking of which, one question we did get from the audience, and this is directed at Dustin. You talked earlier about workforce tax credits. In that context, you were talking about policy changes that we should look at. Can you be more specific about what the policy changes are that you're advocating?
The specific one I would say on the TIF side is there's real restrictions on tax increment finance, on support for housing projects. Low to moderate income, there's a scale, and it gets really tricky. And it's tricky enough that some communities don't provide any incentives for housing because they don't want to have to deal with the formula. But the big restriction is all you really can do is provide public infrastructure, and that's pretty limited, streets, sewers, to a development. I think lifting some of those restrictions, not all of them, do I think that you should be providing TIF incentives to executive level houses in Des Moines? Probably not. But there are ways to do that in a manner where it actually meets the market. The other one that I would think about on the policy changes would be retention. One of the things I've talked about is, we know that we educate a lot of people in the state, and we're one of the worst states in retaining them. And I'm a pretty simple guy, but, we have 2 campuses in Ames and Iowa City that about 50% of their population aren't from the state. And so if you do the math, that's about 30,000 people that come to this state every year on just 2 college campuses. And what are we doing in places like that to say, hey, if you stay, I'm going to give you X, Y, or Z. And retaining, if we could get 10% more of them to not move to Chicago or not move to Minneapolis, and give them a reason to go to these communities like Bill is talking about, I think there's a bigger chance to retain somebody like that rather than trying to attract somebody from a community that just doesn't know Iowa. It's no different. I went through Wichita, Kansas, Craig, like 2 weeks ago. I'm like, this is a really nice town. Didn't know anything about it. It's not that people have a negative view of the state. They have no view. Yeah. So I think those are some simple retention things that I think about from a public policy standpoint, and on the economic development side that are pretty simple. But politics can be pretty challenging in that space because it is a real divide. As Bill mentioned, the rural versus urban that has grown. That's probably the biggest denominator that we see in politics is rural and urban right now too. So having the conversation that's reasonable to say, hey, yes, let's offer an incentive. Maybe it is for communities under a certain threshold, but without that, even your fairly large regional centers are going to continue to struggle.
Can I add something on the workforce housing tax credit specifically?
Please do. Yes.
That's that was set up. The limits on that were set up pre-COVID, and while there's really 2 things with that. It's workforce housing based on the construction cost, and that has increased over time, which is good. But the tax credit that's provided is limited to the first $150,000 worth of construction. So in a rural area, 20% tax credit is $30,000 on a unit, which may sound a lot to some people, but that number has stayed stable, and the value of that $30,000 has really eroded over the past 4 or 5 years. I think one thing that we can do is increase that cap past 150,000 to 225 or 250,000. That makes that tax credit larger. And again, we've got appraisal gaps, particularly in rural areas, particularly for single family housing, that if we're going to attract developers to build, we need to provide more real incentives. And I think that the tax credit is becoming less valuable to people just because of the cost of commodities and that appraisal gap.
Thank you very much, and that's true. That somebody, I think it was you, mentioned earlier that when people do build a project, there's all these costs that they've faced that they wouldn't face if they built it in an urban area, because the cost of transportation, the cost of workers getting there, and all that. So obviously that money doesn't go very far. Bill, you mentioned earlier the Shrink Smart thing. I wanted to spend just a minute talking about that because I think that is an interesting program, although I think it sometimes can elicit maybe the wrong or some pushback on it. It's a program that is funded by $1.5 million from the National Science Foundation, and they're looking at areas, communities in Iowa that lost population, and try to look at the baseline there and measure people's satisfaction with their perceptions of the quality of life. And one of the communities they looked at, and there are several, but one of the communities they looked at is Sac City, which is sort of in Rick's neck of the woods out there. And interestingly, they found that the population had declined there, but the residents' satisfaction with their quality of life has actually improved. And so that's one of those cases where declining population doesn't necessarily mean decline in quality of life. However, here's a question I have of that, is that you could look at that and say, okay, problem solved. We don't have any problems there. But is that true? I mean, does something like Shrink Smart give us a opportunity to say, okay, problem solved. We don't have to worry about broadband anymore. We don't have to worry about housing there. Does that give us a pass? I guess that's my question. But
here's how I have jokingly chided the ISU researchers who developed this. And in reality, you could call Shrink Smart just smart. The stuff that they advocate doing in Shrink Smart is basic economic development. It's leveraging your assets. It's identifying your strengths. It's investing in things that your residents want to see happen. It's addressing those basic needs, whether it's broadband or education or healthcare or arts and culture. Shrink Smart, if you just think of it as a smart approach to community development, makes perfect sense. And I think the Sac City example is a great example where they have leveraged community development and infrastructure, their parks and their public spaces, and their business community and industrial base. I mean, it's almost common sense. But if you separate out, the fact that our population is declining and just say, let's do the right things and realize that we're planting seeds while we do that. Economic development doesn't, the actions you take as a developer don't immediately result in new business or new investment. But you're being an agriculturalist. You're planting seeds that you hope are going to grow and benefit the community for a long time to come. So I think that the idea that you can be a smart community regardless of what's happening to your population is something that a lot of small towns have been dealing with for 124 years since that 1900 census.
And it's constant. You need to keep working at it all the time. So you can't really rest on your laurels. You can't say, well, we're good. We've got all of these things and our quality of life is back. It's only if it's constant. And you talked about Sac City specifically. They've had some things happen. They had a gentleman that passed away that left a large estate to his community. He had a long-term history. That really created a lot of excitement. They were able to do a lot of projects. They pursued things like the downtown facade grant with the state. They had 4-lane Highway 20 completed across to the north of town, which, you know, some people, there was a lot happening and there's a lot been happening, but you've got to sustain that. You just can't rest on your laurels. And so SAC has had a great example of how maybe they've come out of the doldrums. They had some real issues in the late 80s and they've been able to do that. But every community, it's a constant battle, I think, to be able to remain relevant and to have great communities. You have to keep working at it.
And I would add one thing, you know, you've got some great leaders on this call, and you know, like Bill and Rick are doing this all around the state. Rachel is from where she's from and has chosen to be there. And I think it's having the reality of getting people out of the mindset of what we were, and facing the reality of what we are. And then to Bill's point, just being smart about what you want to be. Because I see in my legal work as small town city attorney is it's actually beneficial when in my hometown we've had a number of city council members who aren't from the community. So rather than fighting off what it used to be like in 1985, we don't have to do that. We can think about, okay, what is attractive about a town of 350 people that's fairly close to a large urban center. And think of it that way rather than, well, you know, there were 2 grocery stores in 1945 and, you know, that's great. But it just doesn't make sense. And so that's where I think your leadership has to be, is understanding, and there are communities that don't want to grow. There are communities that are okay with what it is. And so I think anybody wanting to be different has to really be thoughtful in how their plan is going to be achieved.
And Dustin and Rick have both heard me say this many times, and that is, if you've seen one small town, you've seen one small town. Yeah. Every one of them is different and unique, with a different vision and a different way of going about doing things. And there are no cookie cutters when it comes to rural development.
That's an interesting point. I unlike everybody else, I have not heard that before, so that I'll repeat that. Anyway, we're running out of time here, and I just want to thank our panelists for having this discussion and taking time out of your day to talk about this and inform Iowans about the issues that are going on. It's a very important conversation. We could easily fill another hour of this conversation easily. But I want to thank all of you for being here. And I especially want to re-thank our sponsors again who make this possible. I want to talk just a second about Iowa Ideas. This is a 2-day session that this year is just now underway. If you go to iowaideas.com, you'll see the full schedule for today and for tomorrow. There are 9 different tracks, 10 if you include diversity, equity, inclusion. That's not a separate track by itself. Those sessions are built into the other 9 tracks, so each has a DEI component to it as well. Feel free to navigate between any of those sessions. And if you can't miss it, we'll eventually post all the recordings of these sessions. So if there's a conflict in time, you can go back and watch the one you didn't see, couldn't make it to. Also today, don't forget our afternoon keynoter is Frances Hogan, and she is probably best known as the Facebook whistleblower. And her connection to Iowa is that she went to high school in Iowa City, and so got a lot of attention in Iowa. And she's going to be talking about social media And I bet a lot of parents are going to want to watch that as well to get kind of the straight scoop on what you should be concerned about on social media. So with that, I thank you all for being here, and especially thank our audience. And until next year, thank you.